when all the world.
Tack och varmt välkomna till kvällens Pi-symposium. Som ikväll handlar om jakten på förnuftet i en tid när desinformation och antivetenskapliga strömningar genomsyrar världen. Många saker sker nu i vår omvärld som ger oss anledning att misströsta. Men utvecklingen går också åt rätt håll i många avseenden. Kvällens språk kommer av lätt insedda skäl vara engelska. Så jag växlar till det nu. My name is Christer Sturmark. I'm the CEO of the science publisher Fri Tanke. And this Pi-symposium is arranged together with the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, tonight represented by the president of the Academy, Dan Larhammar. Please, Dan, come in. Dan Larhammar. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Christer. I too would like to welcome you to this event on behalf of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. Ever since the Academy was founded in 1739 by Carl von Linné, or Carl Linnaeus, and some fellows of his, the Academy has strived to strengthen the sciences and to reach out to the population at large with scientific information. An excellent opportunity to do that arose when the Academy of Sciences was awarded an exclusive right to print calendars in the mid-1700s. In those days, everyone relied on farming for their lives, so calendars and dates were very important. But a few mishaps had happened after the switch to a new calendar, so the government decided, or probably the king, decided that they needed a reliable, responsible source of the calendars, the Swedish Academy of Sciences. Each year, the calendar brought to people useful information summarized by the Academy on matters such as farming, welfare and health of farm animals, how to treat and prevent diseases in humans, especially children. And one of Carl Linnaeus' colleagues in the Academy, Niels Rosén von Rosenstein, wrote several such information texts on the calendars, and he is considered to be the father of child medicine, that is, pediatrics. He wrote the first modern textbook on that topic. Other texts on the calendars warned against intake of alcohol. The calendar privilege remained until 1972, so for over 200 years the Academy had this as a source or a channel to the population. Now the Academy finds other ways to spread information, one of which is of course to describe the discoveries that are awarded with the scientific prizes, and I'm thinking especially of course on the Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry, and also the Nobel Memorial Prize in economical sciences. And we have others as well, the Crafoord Prizes and the new Sjöberg Cancer Prize. We also are involved in many activities to support school teachers with information and materials, and we arrange seminars and symposia, both in the sciences and about educational matters. We also organize public lectures every month on a broad range of topics. Let me take this opportunity to announce next week's Public Academy lecture. On Wednesday next week, our Academy member, Professor Görel Cavalli-Björkman, will give a very exciting lecture on art with the title False or Genuine, on how to detect fakes. She has also written a book on this topic. The lecture will be in Swedish and will take place at the Natural History Museum. Please check our website for further information. Another Academy member who worked hard to disseminate knowledge to the general public was the late Hans Rosling, whose educational and pedagogical presentations live on in the Gapminder software to tell us about the state of our world. I presume you have all read Factfulness by him, Ola and Anna Rosling. Today's two prominent guests in our collaboration with Fri Tanke also work very much in this spirit with logical reasoning and enlightenment. Rebecca Goldstein and Steven Pinker are role models for clear and logical thinking, who have made and are making crucial contributions to our understanding of human nature and humankind. I look forward to very interesting presentations and a very exciting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Around 7:15, we will take a break of 30 minutes, and we are planning to finish around 8:45. So that's the sort of schedule for tonight. And after the last session, there will be a book signing, just like Martina said. But now over to our first guest. She is a professor of philosophy, a writer of both non-fiction books on philosophy and some biographies, like the one on Spinoza. But she also writes beautiful fiction novels where science and philosophy also plays an important role. That's truly, I think, an example of the third culture, as C.P. Snow called it. Her biography on Spinoza is just out now in Swedish, and we are presenting it here tonight. Spinoza, as you will understand, was so much more than just another Enlightenment philosopher. He was actually a very exciting person and very much ahead of his times. In these politically troubled times in America, it might also be nice to know that our next guest was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama in 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rebecca Goldstein.
Thank you, Christer. I'm so happy to be here in beautiful Stockholm in this beautiful venue and to have the opportunity to speak with you, with Christer and Steve later, about the challenges, social, moral, political, that we are facing today, Americans, certainly, Swedes, but the whole world. So then why am I going to talk to you about an obscure 17th century philosopher? How is he relevant to our challenges? Well, that's what I hope to be able to talk to you about tonight. Benedictus Spinoza died at the age of 44, exactly a year after his death. The small group of his confidants brought to publication a manuscript that had been locked away in his desk drawer. It had been too dangerous to publish during his lifetime. It was too dangerous to publish even after his death. Its very title was incendiary, Ethica, ethics. What's so dangerous about that? Ethics are good. Ethics are the very definition of good. But Spinoza's project was, for his day, dangerously heretical because it was the first attempt of the modern era to establish ethics on purely naturalist grounds, which is to say, non-theist, nothing supernatural, no need for God's commandments or any hocus pocus. It was the first attempt of the modern era to undertake the ethical project, but by no means was it the first attempt ever in the history of mankind, humankind, excuse me. Have to catch myself sometimes. This project had been initiated in ancient Greece during what we could call the first European Enlightenment. Raphael's painting places Plato and Aristotle as the central figures. Quite rightly, Aristotle had been Plato's student, but Raphael portrays Aristotle here as holding his own. Plato's pointing up, and Aristotle's, he's arguing with him. Again, quite rightly. But on the issue before us, whether it's possible, in fact necessary, to keep theism out of the grounding of ethics, Plato and Aristotle were in complete agreement. In fact, it was Plato who, excuse me, in one of his early writings, the Euthyphro, devised a powerful line of reasoning that demonstrates the necessity for non-theistic grounding of ethics. It's known as the Euthyphro argument, and it's an exquisitely elegant construction. Plato asks, or he has his character, Socrates, ask, does God command us to perform good acts because they're good, or are they good because God commands them? Thinking through the two disjuncts of this argument, the either-or, one sees that the upshot of the argument is the irrelevance of any claims about God to moral knowledge. It's a powerful conclusion. Way back when. In gaining insight into morality and understanding the why of it, a divinity's attitudes and commands, even were they to exist and be known, are either redundant, that's the first disjunct, or inadequate, that's the second disjunct. Either God has a reason for his commandments, or he doesn't. If he doesn't, that's the second disjunct, then how does God's arbitrary whim, with nothing behind it, carry any moral force? If there's just no independent reason, one way or the other, then God might command us to do something atrociously immoral, say something as awful as committing genocide. I'll let you read that through for yourself. Or God, on a whim, might endorse slavery. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Or sexism. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. The Euthyphro argument, in other words, what it shows is this second disjunct is inadequate for what makes acts good. So what about that first disjunct, stating that God commands us to perform acts because they're good? Well, that seems a bit better. I mean, at least we could strike out these horrors. But what the first disjunct entails is that God is beside the point. He's redundant when it comes to accounting for ethics. According to the first disjunct, there's a reason that God endorses the good act, a reason independent of God that accounts for its goodness. And if we're going to understand ethics so that we can act rightly, then we're going to have to grasp the God-independent ethical reasons. Whatever it is that accounts for the goodness of good acts must be continuous with the rest of what we know if we're to have reliable ethical knowledge. As the subject matter of ethics is the conduct of humans, so too the way to understand ethics is through our human cognitive faculties of giving accounts, examining implications, testing for internal coherence and empirical adequacy. And this is precisely what the ancient Greek philosophers set out to do during the first European Enlightenment. This was the very project of moral philosophy that they had initiated. And then 2,000 years passed. In the course of those years, Europe became thoroughly theologized, Christianized, and the idea of pursuing moral reasoning apart from theology, apart from claims of God's commands, the project begun in ancient Greece, spirited on by this powerful Euthyphro argument, became unthinkable. The fierce and bloody wars that followed Martin Luther's rebellion against the popes of Rome raged around such issues as whether our acts, no matter how good or evil, make any difference at all in our salvation. Luther argued that they don't. But stretching across the bloody theological divides was the shared presumption that the moral valuation of our lives supervenes on God's purpose for us. Our cognitive faculties are only useful insofar as they're directed toward interpreting God's will. That's what all the bloody theological controversy was about. Even Descartes, traditionally honored as the first modern philosopher, steered clear of questioning the necessity of theology and the grounding of morality. In fact, he steered clear of the entire subject of ethics altogether. The poor man had gotten himself into enough trouble simply by subjecting the existence of God to the standards of rational proof, and also by endorsing the Copernican theory. So before even opening the pages of the manuscript that Spinoza had locked away in his desk drawer, one has got to admire the audacity of the title, trumpeting that the work's aim is one with the project initiated in ancient Greece, which was to employ human reason to know how we best should live, offering us arguments that not only convince, but also motivate us. For as Aristotle had argued, the conclusion of a sound moral argument is an action. Spinoza's ethics is thoroughly naturalist, depending not on claims concerning God's purposes and nature, but concerning human nature. The essence of this nature is what Spinoza called conatus, or conatus, the drive for each individual to persist in his own being and to flourish. Centuries after Spinoza, Darwin's theory of natural selection would confirm Spinoza's intuitions about conatus. And since ethics can't require our violating human nature, ought implies can. We can't be ethically required to do something that it's impossible for us to do. Ethics can't demand, Spinoza argued, that we oppose our own conatus. As reason makes no demand contrary to nature, it demands that every person should love himself, should seek that which is useful to him, that which is really useful to him, should desire everything which really brings a person to greater perfection, and should each for himself endeavor as far as he can to preserve his own being. This is as necessarily true as that a whole is greater than its part. The centrality of conatus in his derivations might lead one to anticipate a ruthlessly individualistic ethics, a foreshadowing of Nietzsche's will to power, and contempt for moralities touting the common good. But that isn't the direction toward which Spinoza leads. Note that qualifying phrase, I mean that which is really useful to him. We can be mistaken about that. The role of reason in ethics is to determine, based on our systematic knowledge of human nature, what is really useful to us in our lifelong project of striving to persist and to flourish. His reasoning leads Spinoza to his version of the golden rule. Hence, those humans who are governed by reason desire for themselves nothing which they do not also desire for the rest of humanity, and consequently are just, faithful, and honorable in their conduct. But no matter how high-minded the ethics that Spinoza derives is, and it is really, really high-minded, the mere fact that it's derived independent of claims concerning God's will made it blasphemously transgressive. A naturalist ethics undercuts what had come to be regarded, as it still is by so many, as one of the major arguments for the necessity of God's existence, namely that without God, there is no way of grounding ethics in objectivity and universality. Everything collapses under relativism, goes the reasoning. Spinoza grounds his ethics in the objectivity and universality of human nature. The other major argument one still often hears by theists is that God is necessary to explain why there is something rather than nothing. According to the theist conception, God exists apart from spatio-temporal nature, which was only brought into being, together with all of its laws, by God's will. Here, too, Spinoza undercuts the argument as he explores the possibility that nature can provide its own explanation for itself, for why it is as it is, governed by the laws by which it's governed, for why it exists at all. No recourse to the concept of a transcendent God is necessary. In fact, Spinoza goes a good sight further. No concept of a transcendent God, he argues, is even possible. A transcendent God, such as the Abrahamic religions claim to worship, a God whose will is let there be's, accounts for the creation and nature of the world, is impossible to coherently conceive of. For the very concept of God's will compels us to the irreducibly arbitrary, that for which there's no reason, just is, simply is the case, no reason at all. And for Spinoza, the introduction of any arbitrary element vitiates an explanation as much as an out-and-out contradiction does. This leads him to the conclusion that not only can nature explain itself, which would be sufficient to derail the theistic argument, but that it must. Nature simply must hold within itself the explanation for itself. A self-explanatory nature is the only way to expel all arbitrariness from our conception of the universe. And this leads him to a conclusion at the very dawn of modern physics that many contemporary physicists find still seductively attractive. A final theory, or a theory of everything, a theory that would explain the ultimate laws of nature and explain why they have to be the ultimate laws of nature. If we were truly to understand the laws of nature at this ultimate level, we would understand why, out of the seeming many possibilities for the laws of nature, these are the ones that had to be realized. Indeed, they would provide the explanation for why they needed to be realized in nature, and so why something had to come from nothing. This view of a self-explanatory nature has been echoed by many physicists, and perhaps most prominently by Albert Einstein, who had a real bromance with Spinoza. In fact, that's a love letter penned by Albert Einstein to Spinoza. It begins with, well, in English, how much do I love this noble man, more than words can ever say. He wrote it in 1919. Einstein also abhorred the presence of the irreducibly arbitrary in any explanation. And that was one of the reasons that he was such an ardent admirer of Spinoza. Whenever he was asked about his view on God and ethics, and he was asked very, very often, because once general relativity was confirmed, he became the sage of the world, and they asked him about everything. Rather like our next speaker, I think. He would always, when he was asked about God and ethics, he would always resort to Spinoza. There are many, many beautiful such answers he gave, but here is one. It seems to me that the idea of a personal God is an anthropological concept which I cannot take seriously. My views are near those of Spinoza. Admiration for the beauty of and belief in the logical simplicity of the order which we can grasp humbly and only imperfectly. I believe that we have to content ourselves with our imperfect knowledge and understanding and treat values and moral obligations as a purely human problem, the most important of all human problems. But, I mean, I won't go into the whole romance between the two, but it gives you a sense of the fact that this philosopher, with his rigorous, dry, logical proofs, is able to inspire passion and love. So, the two major arguments for claiming that God is a necessity are undermined by Spinoza in his Ethics, and now you understand why the manuscript was locked up in his desk. He had already been excommunicated by his own Jewish community of Amsterdam at the tender age of 24, before he had ever published a word. Spinoza interrupted the writing of this magnificent book, the Ethics, in order to write and anonymously publish another book, Tractatus Theologico Politicus. And this book was written with the sole purpose of preparing the way, of trying to make it safe to publish Ethica. It argues that free and rigorous reason, no matter what unorthodox conclusions it might reach, cannot threaten civic well-being, but is rather demanded for civic well-being. That's actually a translation of the subtitle of the book that I just gave. It is always, Spinoza argues, in our interests, individually and collectively, to know the truth. And we have only our cognitive faculties for judging truth. A society built on the suppression of the truth is inherently unstable, listing dangerously toward repressive authoritarianism. And I want to, so this is the title page of the book, and I want to focus down at the end there. It was published anonymously. Spinoza's name doesn't appear. He was no fool. It doesn't appear on this title page. And there's also a false city of publication. It's listed as Hamburg rather than as Amsterdam. The publisher had been a friend of Spinoza's, and it's also by a fictitious publisher that's listed there, Heinrichus Kunrat. As a work of making the world tolerant enough so that Spinoza could safely publish Ethica, the Tractatus failed miserably. For in the course of making his major argument, which was provocative enough in itself, he dropped such bombshells as that miracles are ridiculously impossible, that the exalted prophets of old excelled only in their overheated imaginations, that the Old Testament had at least 4 authors, none of them Moses, and that one must interpret Scripture without ever compromising reason. For if one makes reason subservient to Scripture, then the prejudice of a common people of long ago will gain a hold on one's understanding and darken it. The identity of the author of the Tractatus was soon enough known, and the vehemence with which he was condemned as Satan's emissary on earth convinced all who cared about his continued persistence and flourishing to abandon any hope of his publishing his magnum opus, the Ethics, during his lifetime. He went back to completing it, working during the quiet, candlelit hours. His days were given over to the lens grinding with which he supported himself. That's a kind of machine he worked on, using the new science of optics to such good effect that the prominent Dutch astronomer Christian Huygens demanded only Spinoza's lenses for his telescopes. The dust from Spinoza's daytime occupation exacerbated his pre-existing lung disease. The magnum opus remained safely locked away, awaiting his death, which came 6 years after the publication of the Tractatus. The notoriety of Spinoza didn't diminish with his death. He was branded not only an atheist, but by invalidating the 2 strongest arguments for the necessity of God, the most dangerous atheist whom the forces of damnation had ever spit forth from the fires of hell. I'm quoting. I can't make up this stuff. The fact that he had lived in every way, except for his thinking, as blameless as a monk, or at any rate, as a monk is supposed to live, seemed to infuriate his critics as much as anything else, subverting, as it did, the claim that the absence of a belief in an all-seeing God could only lead to turpitude. Well-rehearsed enunciations of Spinoza became a prerequisite for entrance into the academic and ecclesiastical ranks. That was what your orals consisted of. You had to have your refutations of the demon Spinoza in place, so that by 1710, there had been assembled in Leipzig an extensive Catalogus Scriptorium Anti-Spinozanorum. All the attention, even though negative, kept the Ethica active in many minds, very good minds, the ones trying to get into the academy and into the clerisy. And some of those minds were susceptible to the persuasive power of this very powerful book, which, through the accumulation of its meticulous proofs, builds to a crescendo of emotion. For it's another claim of Spinoza's that the progress of reason isn't a dry and emotionless pursuit, but rather one in which the negative passions that come from our passivity before the course of nature, which is what Spinoza called human bondage, these negative emotions are transformed into the active, empowering, and exquisitely pleasurable emotions of understanding. The last sections of the Ethics are meant to induce in us a rationally attained emotion that is so expansive and so self-transcendent that it will reconcile us even to our own inevitable death. That's what he ends up talking about. It will reconcile us to our mortality without promising us the impossibility that religious faith promises, namely immortality. But then, as he writes, the free man thinks of death, least of all things, and his wisdom is a meditation of life, not of death. It's a transformative book. It's my favorite book to teach, watching what it does to my students. It's a transformative book, and in retrospect, perhaps it wasn't altogether prudent for the religious and academic authorities to demand that those seeking admittance to their rank must carefully consider Spinoza in order to know how to refute him, since for some, the careful consideration led to persuasion. An underground appreciation of what came to be called Spinozism gradually gathered strength internationally, swelling roughly 100 years after the philosopher's death into the social, political, and ethical transformation that we call the European Enlightenment. I call it the Second European Enlightenment. Rejecting the traditional forms of authority, both religious and civic, promoting reason and science over religious dogma, republicanism over monarchy, and a humanistic morality that, in valuing the moral worth of every individual, forms the core of the commitment to liberal democracy and universal human rights. We're still playing it out with much work to do. The solitary philosopher's labors, undertaken in the midnight hours and then locked away in a desk to await his death, had, by reconnecting moral philosophy with the project initiated in the ancient past, managed to propel humanity into a better present, and with our own commitment to pay it forward, a better future. Thank you. Thank you.
Rebecca Goldstein. What a man, yes. We will hear much more about Spinoza after the break. I know that Spinoza played a very special role in Rebecca's personal life when she was a teenager. I hope to be able to talk to her about that after the break. In just over a month, it's the 25th of December. As you probably all know, long time ago, a little boy was born on that day, and when he became a grown-up man, he came to revolutionize the world. I'm of course referring to Isaac Newton, who was born 25th of December, 1642. This evening is in the spirit of people like Spinoza and Isaac Newton. They created the foundation for the scientific and Enlightenment thinking of today. Now to our next speaker. We are so happy that he could join Rebecca on this trip to Sweden. He's a professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, as well as an author of many books. His latest book, Enlightenment Now, Upplysning Nu, was published in Swedish just a year ago. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rebecca Goldstein's husband, Steven Pinker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A number of years ago, the Times of London did a profile of me and Rebecca, and the headline was, "There's a third person in this marriage, Spinoza." I'm not a jealous person. Among other things, I acknowledge that Spinoza had much better hair, and it goes on from there. But there's a way in which both the title of that profile and indeed the title of Rebecca's book in Swedish, Spinoza and Me, is somewhat misleading because Rebecca is not a Spinozologist. It's not as if she has devoted her intellectual life to exegesis of a particular thinker. Indeed, that would be quite contrary to the spirit of Spinoza himself, who, as I learned from Rebecca, is denied that the personal, the idiosyncratic quirks of one's one's biography, one's culture, one's history ought to affect the acceptance of that person's ideas or the understanding of that person's ideas. Indeed, the English title of Rebecca's book was Betraying Spinoza, the betrayal being the fact that, that by Spinoza's own lights, attempting to explain why he had the ideas that he had when he had them, that because of the cultural milieu of Amsterdam, the historical background of the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, as Rebecca tried to do, was in a sense a betrayal of Spinoza's own idea, that is the internal logic of the ideas that matters, and that the personal, the cultural, the historical are something of a distraction. And so Rebecca's influence on me, including ideas of Spinoza, did not come in particular from the great man, but from a set of ideas, and as Rebecca noted, originating in classical Athens, that continue to be indispensable in a surprising number of issues today. Spinoza deserves credit for formulating them in a way that continues to be influential and made me realize that they have influenced me. One of these influences pertains to his magnum opus, Ethics, and it is something that where an early conversation with Rebecca helped me formulate an idea that I was clumsily groping toward, that came from my reflection on human nature and why it is such a morally and politically contentious subject. I work in language, I work in vision, I work in many aspects of human psychology. And I had noticed that there was in the various nature-nurture debates that energize psychology, there are empirical issues. That is, what influence does the genome have on our personalities and our intellects? But there's also a moral and political and emotional baggage connected to the nature-nurture debate. I wrote a book called The Blank Slate, Tabula Rasa, on the modern denial of the existence of human nature, the belief that the human mind is a blank slate that gets all of its structure and content from parenting, from socialization, from culture. I argue that scientifically the blank slate theory is false, but I tried to explore why there is such a thrust to believe in the blank slate, why so many people believe that it is a safer and more acceptable view of the mind, despite its implausibility, because blank slates don't do anything, and human minds do a great deal. One of the sources of resistance is, I argued, was a fear of nihilism, that if human nature is a product of the structure of the brain itself is shaped in ontogeny by the genome, together with input from the senses. The content of the genome itself was shaped by the process of natural selection. But as indeed Spinoza insisted, We are physical systems. There is no supernatural entity that animates us, that gives us our intelligence, our will, our emotion. We are physical systems. And we are intelligible physical systems. The human mind can be studied like any other object in the universe. Well, to many people, this is deeply disconcerting. One of the reviews of one of my earlier books said, alluding to a rock band of the time, said, "Are we meat puppets?" That is, do we lack an immaterial soul? This, to many people, this was a terrifying concept, even as late as the turn of the 21st century, because it would imply that morality is a figment of our imaginations, that it may be an adaptation that natural selection wired into us to allow us to cooperate. But like our other perceptions and emotions, we may be mistaken in projecting it onto reality. So we know that even though there exists a wavelength of light, the qualitative difference between red and green has no correlate in reality, in the world. It's just the way our brains were wired over the course of natural selection, perhaps to allow our primate ancestors to detect ripe fruit against foliage. Likewise, our tastes, our sentiments, the coloration of our emotional lives does not correspond to anything that is out there in the universe, that, at least not directly. The fact that we find flowers pleasant to smell and dung repulsive, well, if we were dung beetles, it would be the other way around. Just the way our brains happen to be wired. The fact that looking down at the edge of a cliff is terrifying, well, it's just distance. The fact that it's terrifying reflects the fact that it just happens to be dangerous to us. Well, what if that was true of right and wrong? That if right and wrong were just figments of our imagination, there would be no objective reality. Could we learn through intellectual analysis to doubt our moral convictions in the same way that we have come to learn that our perception of color is due to the structure of our brain? And if so, wouldn't that sap or undermine our conviction that murder objectively is wrong? It's not merely distasteful to us given our brains. Now, I argued as I was writing the blank slate, I argued that this does not necessarily follow, that there are aspects of reality that we perceive that are constructions of our brain, but they're constructions of our brain because they're also out there, and our brain is adapted to perceiving and conceiving certain aspects of reality. So we may get a yawning sensation when we look down on the edge of the cliff, but there really is a cliff and there really is a ground below. There really is wavelength of light. We have a sense of number that has various quirks and illusions and fallacies and biases. That's why we have to study mathematics. But one could say that even something as abstract as a number may have an objective existence, almost a Platonic existence, independent of the fact that our brains evolved with a number sense that appreciates them. That this is the theory of mathematical realism, something that the characters in Rebecca's first novel, The Mind-Body Problem, grappled with. Well, if there can be mathematical realism, if the laws of mathematics exist independently of human minds and human minds discover them rather than inventing them, could there be laws of morality that exist independent of human minds, which we also, in some sense, discover rather than merely invent as social conventions? I struggled with this, and it was in conversations with Rebecca that she explained why the theory of moral realism, though not accepted by all philosophers by any means, has some warrant, some grounding, and you saw it on the slide. Spinoza captured it by saying those who are moved by reason want nothing for themselves that they do not also want for all of humankind. his version of the golden rule, and there are other versions, the Kant's categorical imperative. Spinoza himself also used the metaphor of the viewpoint from eternity as the one that we ought to take in choosing our acts. One could also maybe put all of the different versions of the golden rule under the bigger rubric of impartiality. I think this was from the 19th century philosopher Henry Sidgwick proposed that this was the ultimate reality behind morality, which is that there is nothing magic about the pronoun me. There's nothing that, as soon as I engage in any kind of discourse or reason or persuasion or agreement with someone else, I can't insist that only my interests count because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Now, if I was galactic overlord and I knew that in perpetuity I would never have to persuade anyone of anything, perhaps I could be a completely selfish egotist and not worry about the fact that such a position is incoherent. But as long as I depend or might depend on the graces of anyone else in the universe, and I have to advance some code that we can all live by, then I goes out the window. I have to take the viewpoint from eternity. I have to want for everyone what I want for myself. So that is a kind of a grounding of morality, a moral realism that, go back to my original theme, means that even if we study the moral sense as psychologists, even if we think that the human brain is a biological adaptation, it does not mean that morality is just a hallucination or something that could change in the same way that fashions change, like men's neckties get wider, then they get narrower. So that was one major influence of the ideas that Spinoza clarified via my conversations with Rebecca. Another is whether the thesis of the Tractatus is valid. The Tractatus made an empirical prediction, namely that societies that are governed by reason rather than by religious scripture, like a theocracy, rather than by authority, tradition, monarchy, but where by dogma or ideology. That is what we now call liberal democracies, in which we try to formulate laws and policies by empirical evidence, by persuasion, by whether they work or not, in particular whether they foster human flourishing. Well, is this a good idea? Is this really the best way to run a society? And maybe it is, but maybe it isn't. There is a counter-argument that we humans are just too intellectually and morally feeble to come up with ways of organizing our lives, that we need some moral code, some set of traditions that transcends any one of us, that comes from an authority that can claim greater grounding. This being, of course, the church with its rock-solid moral foundations and its legacy of thousands of years of moral pronouncements. Well, this is an empirical prediction. Are we better off since societies moved from absolute monarchy and theocracy to Enlightenment principles of free speech, open inquiry, rational discourse, empirical evidence? And I've written 2 books that suggest that the answer is yes. That that it is inevitable that societies make progress, but simply that if we agree on what would count as progress, even in theory, related to human flourishing, to conatus, the urge of each one of us to be alive rather than dead, and nourished rather than starving, and healthy rather than sick, part of a society rather than isolated, then any one of those dimensions of human flourishing, when measured over the course of history shows improvement on different time scales, but I have presented in graphs the case that societies really have been better off since we adopted Enlightenment principles of democratic governance and international cooperation. For example, Rebecca mentioned that Spinoza died at the age of 44. That was not uncommon in his day. If he had been born 350 years later, he probably would have lived twice as long, because human lifespans have increased over the last 2 centuries from about 30 to about, in developed countries, to more than 80. Child mortality has fallen in Sweden, where records go back the farthest, from about 1/3 of children not living to see their 5th birthday to about 1/100th of that risk. Maternal mortality has fallen from about 1% of childbirths to 1/200th of that level. Extreme poverty has fallen from 90% of humanity 2 centuries ago to less than 9%. Illiteracy used to be applied to, well, I will turn it around. Literacy used to be a privilege of an aristocratic and clerical few. About 15% of Europeans could read and write 3 centuries ago. Today, worldwide, 90% of people can read and write under the age of 25, 80% overall. War used to be the natural state of relations between empires and countries. But the rate of war has come down, especially since 1945, and the rate of death in war has plummeted as well, from about 25 per 100,000 per year to 1 per 100,000 per year. And interpersonal violence, rape, homicide, assault have all come down in the last few centuries. So the great experiment that one could say Spinoza proposed in the Tractatus, that theocracy and autocracy and monarchy are not optimal ways of organizing society. Indeed, a radical position in his day turned out to be vindicated. He was right. That really is a better way of running things, not only in comparisons over time, but in comparisons across countries. Not every country has adopted the tenets of liberal democracy. We still have some theocracies. Degree of religious belief varies quite significantly across countries, even among Western societies and even among smaller polities like the 50 American states. And it turns out that in correlations of well-being, that is a composite of longevity, education, safety, and so on, that correlates negatively rather than positively with degree of religious belief. So contrary to the fear that if one were ever to have a secular society, like those of Northern and Western Europe, that people would degenerate into decadence and violence, it seems to be the other way around, that secular liberal democracies are the happiest and healthiest countries in the world today, probably in the history of our species. This speaks to a local controversy in the United States of the last couple of weeks. Our Attorney General, the highest law enforcement official in the country, gave a speech in which he said that the decline of religion has led to all of the degeneracy and decadence and evil of modern society, and that we have to basically, he didn't use these words, but we have to undo Spinoza and go back to theocracy. This is the Attorney General of the United States. But it turns out that empirically he was mistaken. Even among the 50 American states, the ones that have the lowest degree of religious belief have the longest lives, highest amount of education, least amounts of drug abuse, least amounts of infant mortality, highest school achievement, and so on. This brings me to the last issue that I'll raise that affects the kind of issues that I deal with and that were in many ways foreshadowed by Spinoza and the reactions to him. Rebecca talked about the fact that Spinoza was reviled for for most of the aftermath of his life in Amsterdam. Whereas today, as one of the reviews of Rebecca's book was entitled, "Everybody Loves Spinoza." But that was not always true. It was not true in his own life when, as we learned, he was excommunicated by his own community. He had to publish, his books were not published until after his death, and even then under false imprimatur. And then for 150 years later, he was an object of fear and terror and hatred. The idea that we ought to use reason to promote human flourishing, which may seem so banal, so trite, so anodyne that it would hardly even need defending, turns out to be a blazingly controversial idea. There is an alternative to the Enlightenment values of Spinoza. We can call it the counter-Enlightenment. And a major theme of the romantic counter-Enlightenment of the 19th century, of romantic militarism, romantic nationalism, romantic parochialism, the elevation of emotion over reason. A lot of it consisted of reviling the ideas of this Dutch apostate Jew of the 17th century. This continues to the present day. When I present data on progress, many people confront me with, well, what about all of the counterexamples to progress? What about the rise of fascism, the two world wars, and even today, the rise of authoritarian populism, which in many ways is hostile to science, opposed to the application of reason to the design of government and policy and law, but vests authority in a charismatic leader who just embodies the authenticity and goodness of a people, that seeks to restore religion as the basis for morality, as we heard just 2 weeks ago from our Attorney General. And indeed, the tension, the conflict between Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment principles has been, I think, one of the major dialectics of Western history. It's one of the reasons why when some people ask whether my own books on Enlightenment, The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, is that a defense of Western civilization? And the answer I give is no. For two reasons. One of them is that if these are good ideas, even though they had to come from somewhere, that doesn't make them Western ideas. And indeed, the stock of knowledge and values and political ideas that today constitute cosmopolitan, secular, liberal democracies, some of them came from Europe, some of them came from the Americas, some of them came from Africa and Asia. Many of them came from Western Europe at the time of the 18th century, but all ideas have to come from somewhere. But even more to the point of why Enlightenment values should not be confused with Western values is that for much of the history of the West hated the Enlightenment. They excommunicated Spinoza and prevented the publication of his books and had educational curricula designed to get people to hate Spinoza, and we're still very much living with with that tension today, with a I hope temporary resurgence of anti-Enlightenment sentiment in the rise of authoritarian populism. Finally, and this also speaks to why, even though I actually do use a quote from Spinoza, the one that Rebecca had on those who are guided by reason, want nothing for themselves, that they do not also want for all of humanity. I use that as one of the two epigraphs of my book, Enlightenment Now. But stepping even back from that, there is my own attempt to document the reality of progress as an empirical phenomenon, as a fact, crucially hinges on perhaps the greatest of Spinoza's themes, and that is that the use of reason to promote human flourishing. The biggest misconception that I have faced when I talk about facts like maternal mortality has decreased, longevity has increased, deaths in war have decreased, is that people attribute these developments to a force called progress, that as if there is some process in the universe that lifts humanity ever higher, which in turn leads to skepticism about progress when people will say, well, what about Donald Trump? What about the car bombings in Stockholm? What about the obesity epidemic in the United States? As if we should expect that progress just makes everything better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. And that, in fact, would not be progress. That would be a miracle. And progress is not a miracle. Progress is a human accomplishment. Progress is not a force. Progress is a phenomenon that needs to be explained. How do we explain the fact that we have made progress despite all of the forces that really do exist in nature that, if anything, grind us down? The second law of thermodynamics, the evolutionary arms races between hosts and pathogens. But despite all this, we have made progress. Why? I would argue that it's because of the key idea that we can perhaps attribute to Spinoza, that we ought to use reason and science. We ought to treat the universe as intelligible, that the things that happen, the diseases, the famines, even the wars and autocracies, are lawful. If we apply reason, we can seek to understand them. If we understand them, we can try to change them. And we ought to change them in a way that promotes human conatus, the striving to persist in our being and to flourish. If, to the extent that those ideas are influential, progress could continue. And if they are not, then they may not. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
So, thank you so much for that. Now I'd like to invite Rebecca and Steve up on stage for a discussion on reason and enlightenment and everything that comes with it and goes with it. Yes, a big hand. Please sit down, some water. Actually, before we go into the big questions on reason and enlightenment and what's happening in the world right now, I actually like to start with your personal story, Rebecca, because you gave a wonderful speech on Spinoza, but I happen to know that Spinoza actually meant a lot for you personally when you grew up. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and I will only accede to your request because in telling my story, I know I'm not just telling my story, that I'm just a replication that happened through the ages of people finding themselves to this book. And but in my particular circumstances, I did happen to grow up in a very religious household, and it was the kind of household, I mean, my family were Jewish, and my family had a very sad history in Europe, and came to the U.S. But and I was sent to a ultra-religious high school, and we were just being prepared to be wives and mothers. Basically, we were not even supposed to go to college, and many of the girls would get engaged while they were still in high school. Anyway, there was this class in Jewish history. And I ought to say, I was a very bad student. I hated the school, and I mostly played hooky. And I just hated being there. So, but that day, I came to class, and we were learning about modernity in this class. And we were against it. The class, was like everything was downhill since Babylonia, basically, and and as a cautionary tale, the story was told about Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, was born Baruch, the Hebrew name that means blessed, and when he was excommunicated from his Jewish community, he changed his name to Benedictus, blessed in Latin. You know, and my ears perked up, and the teacher happened to say two very interesting things to me. One was that he believed that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, was not written by God. I thought, that's an interesting idea. And the second was that he thought that God was nature. And I was very into science already on my own, and I thought, I wonder what he had in mind. You know, that sounds interesting. Anyway, so that did, yeah, I guess, you know, and then it was all downhill or uphill, depending on your point of view since then. But the other thing was that I then, you know, eventually became a philosopher, and there's a split in philosophy between sort of the kind of philosophy that takes science very, very seriously and considers philosophy as somewhat continuous with science, and who believes that it's very important for philosophers to know science, analytic philosophy, and I belonged to that camp. And then the more sort of existentialist and more literary and emotional type of philosophy, I was against that camp. And Spinoza there too was sort of held up as a bad example because he tries to do everything through pure reason. It's real metaphysics, you know, and that was considered to be, you know, quite, you know, impossible by the camp to which I subscribed. So it's really weird that I came, and I just, when I was a professor, I decided I hadn't done much in the history of philosophy. I was mostly interested in contemporary philosophy of physics and that sort of philosophy of mathematics. So I did, the most efficient way of learning something is to offer to teach a course in it. And, you know, and there's no fear like...
Or write a book about it.
Or write a book about it. But there with your students, your critical students, you know, and you don't want to appear a fool to them, so you study very, very hard. And I think the first time I read the ethics, I was very dismissive. What is this? This is meaningless. You know, what is this stuff? It's not science. It's not philosophy. What is this? I read it, I think a few more times, and I began to see the hidden premises that make the conclusions go through, and also to see the deep intuitions that have really been borne out. And he really got to me. And so, you know, just to end it, this little saga, but I often feel like I'm the only New York intellectual who hasn't been in psychoanalysis. When people say, what, you've never been to therapy? I say, I read Spinoza because he does help me get this kind of distance from things, a kind of perspective.
How did your family react to this when you were a young girl? I mean, you grew up in a quite orthodox
Yes,
Jewish
very
context.
orthodox.
Ultra-orthodox, maybe, even.
It was pretty orthodox, yeah. But, well, I don't know. I got married the first time very young to an Orthodox man, and my mother's parting words to him were, now she's your problem. So, yeah.
My favorite story of the reaction of Rebecca's family to her
I'm just fixing
discovering the philosophical case for atheism is that Rebecca said she was very much influenced by Bertrand Russell's book, Why I Am Not a Christian. And for her family, fine, you're not a Christian.
Yeah, they saw me studying this. Yeah, so Bertrand Russell goes through all the arguments for God's existence and, you know, pretty much destroys them, including the moral argument for God's existence, using the Euthyphro argument, not giving Plato credit, but...
I had no problem with that.
Yeah.
Why I'm not a Christian.
Russell is actually one of the few non-fiction authors that got the Nobel Prize of Literature.
Yes, him, yes, and...
This year, it's a quite controversial issue you might know of.
No, I didn't know.
Peter Handke is a very controversial Nobel Prize laureate this year. But anyway, normally the prize goes to fiction writers only, but Bertrand Russell actually
Bertrand Russell and Henri Bergson, another philosopher.
Yeah,
also.
that's right.
Yeah.
And Winston Churchill, non-fiction at least,
Yes.
not a philosopher,
Right.
but non-fiction.
Right.
Okay, but so Spinoza meant a lot for you to sort of break free from the dogmas that you were brought up with. Or
Yes.
it's a question.
He was the gateway drug.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. 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 Talking about the more global issue now. I mean, you're both express an optimism on what reason and enlightenment can give us. But I'm just thinking, if you look back the last 15, 20 years, Hindu nationalism in India, Brexit in England, Trump, Russia, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, is reason really making progress right now?
Well, I tend to think there's greater inequality in reason, because at the high end, there's never been more reason. Not only is science continuing to make spectacular advances, but the resources available to those who are committed to reason has never been greater. We have evidence-based medicine replacing just the intuition of doctors. We have fact-checking routinely applied to politicians' claims, which was not true 15 years ago. We have the amazing accessibility to knowledge in online encyclopedias and fact-checking sources that it's common now. You pull out your smartphone and you can fact-check something, you can look something up. But of course we also have conspiracy theories and vaccine denial and beliefs that the moon landing was faked, and a number of the beliefs that led to the election of authoritarian populist candidates. So we have, both at the high and the low end, I think some increases.
Is it a polarization going on?
There is a polarization. I also don't think that there's nothing inevitable about the advance of reason, because it always has to push back against darker forces of human nature. Both our cognitive limitations, our biases, our illusions, the kind of things documented by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and Paul Slovic and other cognitive psychologists, and the darker sides of our moral sense, the fact that we often esteem not so much people who enhance human flourishing, but those who are we esteem authorities, we value conformity, we value some notion of purity and asceticism, and we confuse all of those with moral value. And we fall into line accordingly in solidarity with our tribe and obedience to a charismatic authority. So those, I think, are part of us, and they'll always be a drag on the advance of reason. I think reason can only advance if there are institutions and norms that fortify it against the undertow of human nature. Principles like free speech, free thought, to use a relevant expression this evening. The checks and balances of a democratic governance, the human rights enshrined in liberal democracies, international law, all the things that are quite unnatural and artificial, but are very good things for all that, because they fortify the more rational part of human nature against the constant backlash of the darker parts.
Yeah, but it's interesting, and you point out that the last 15 and 20 years, something has happened, and I think it does behoove us to look at that. Why is there is a polarization, and there is a great gap, and yes, the people we know are marching forward at ever greater progress. But it's there have been sociological, economic forces and political forces, well, often political forces taking advantage of the sociological, economic forces that have, caused real resentments to arise. And, and the people who are not partaking in what the Enlightenment has given us, to their own, to their own misfortunes. Their lives are often not very good. And, and that certain forces have really brought this to the fore, and canny and often exploitive political forces have taken advantage of this, have sensed it, and have played on it. I mean, that's certainly, I have become too much of a student of what's going on in the United States. I can't wait to become politically apathetic again. But it is to watch, what is going on, and the that these demagogic forces just so much like Plato had spoken about is really kind of amazing, taking advantage of resentments of those who, perhaps their reasoning abilities are not as strong as others. They're unfortunate in that way. It's a great misfortune on their part. But things have happened to increase their misfortunes, and I think it's very important. It is reasonable for us. It is part of the march of reason to sympathize with what's going on here and to not leave them at the mercy of demagogues.
But I'm also thinking, I mean, your current president created this concept of alternative facts, for example. And but I mean, that's one thing that I think, was it New York Times who said that he has tweeted over 13,000 fake news since he came into power.
It was the Washington Post.
That's right. Sorry,
Yes.
I said it wrong earlier and I still say it wrong. That's good. Thanks for correcting my alternative fact. No, but my point is, that's one thing. I mean, he's doing all these things, but it seems to legitimize other actions. I just read yesterday that Ohio State passed a bill saying that students who answers questions in exams that are scientifically wrong, but they do it on basis of their religious beliefs, their answers should be accepted. They should, for example.
Yeah.
And I mean, I see a connection here. Trump's alternative facts is okay, according to the president, and then it's okay to do this. So where's this going to end? Is objective facts not in fashion anymore?
It's a very interesting thing that's happened, that things that are subject to empirical testing, validation, verification can become a test of your loyalty to your political tribe. And and in fact, so the more you believe in something that has been empirically invalidated by those experts, right? The greater your loyalty. So climate change, for example, the very fact that 98% of climate scientists endorse man-made climate change means that if you deny it, you're really loyal. It's like, believing in Jesus walking on the water or Moses splitting the sea. It's so impossible. That's how much I believe that I'll go in the face of all evidence. So this is such a dangerous thing, that these things that are empirically validated can become the slogans, the banners behind which certain political troops, tribes, are marching. It's something that's happened, and it's very, very dangerous to truth.
Yeah.
It's extremely dangerous. Loyalty, political loyalty trumps truth.
This is what Professor Dan Kane calls politically motivated reasoning.
Yeah.
Reasoning that is actually, motivated by the identity you want to uphold instead of facts.
Exactly, but even more than that, the crazier the thing you believe, that shows what a true believer you are, and so you gain points that way.
But why doesn't reason stand up to that? I mean, reason as the big concept of reason, why doesn't it stand up to that? Are we cognitively not capable of reasoning in a neutral way?
I think we have difficulty when it when the conclusions of reason compromise either our own claim to power, wisdom, moral rectitude, or that of our group, our tribe that we belong to. That, as Kahan points out, it's not that that every scientific issue is subject to superstition and dogma and irrationality. There's not a huge debate over whether antibiotics work or whether it's E equals mc squared or E equals mc cubed.
But
there are a few.
Vaccines, yeah.
But vaccine safety,
Yeah.
there's a certain number of issues that get politicized, that have a kind of moral coloration attached to them. And I suspect that in Ohio, those are the ones where students can get credit. So that if they deny, for example, that humans and modern apes have a common ancestor 5 to 7 million years ago, they're not penalized for saying that. But I think if they endorse the inverse cube law for the amplitude of propagated sound, that probably would not get correct marks on the exam.
Yeah.
There are certain issues. I think that we have many reasons for making certain pronouncements, making certain propositions, and as humans, that is, in human nature. And the fact that they're true is one of them. It's not the only one. Many propositions are more emotive. They're ways of saying hooray for this or boo that. So it's not clear, for example, that the people who believed that Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring out of a pizza parlor in Washington, do they really believe that? Or by saying they believed it, are they saying boo Hillary? And I think a lot of, likewise, facts and reason can be a nuisance if they show that you yourself have made embarrassing errors and therefore must forfeit your claim to wisdom and infallibility. And so people will individually and collectively cling to false beliefs if they put they themselves in better light. And of course, if we're in a court of law, in science, in philosophy, we adopt a norm. One should only say things that are true. But that is, it's an exotic, unnatural commitment, and there's always pushback.
And even there in science and philosophy, once you've committed yourself to your theory,
Yes.
There is, psychology plays a role there as well. Psychology is always with us, and I think it's important for we who proclaim the value of reason and science to be aware of it in ourselves. Part of what it is to be aware, to endorse reason, and truth is to be always filled with self-doubt, or open to question, always ready to hear the opposing point of view and to engage with as many opposing points of view as possible. And that doesn't always take place in science. I can certainly speak for philosophy. It doesn't always take place in philosophy.
Well, it's precisely why there are norms like empirical testing and logical rigor, simply because personal conviction and authority of esteemed figures, we know can lead to error.
Yeah.
And norms such as it's okay for a graduate student to raise her hand in a seminar and challenge the esteemed, much decorated scientist or philosopher.
Yeah.
And some witnesses to not just academic discussions, but even a school. You bring kids in to see how the principal and the teachers meet in a committee, or how a school board has its meeting, and often they're shocked. Did you hear that teacher who was just hired challenged the principal? She dissed him. It's amazing that she did that. But one of the norms of civil society, modern institutions, is that authority counts for little, if anything, and that it's just the cogency of one's argument that counts. Anyone can challenge anyone.
In the ideal.
In the ideal, and that's why we need it, because if without that explicit commitment, then authority would prevail.
I mean, another thing that has been such a source of, over my lifetime, a source of of help with critical reason is the widening of the circle of dialogue of the, of how many people are let in, for example, women, or people of minorities of various sorts, and this makes such a huge difference because I've actually noticed what's happened in moral philosophy since women have become more of a presence. The sorts of questions that are taken up about morality in the family and that these sorts of conflicts, but also in philosophy, the way we make progress often is by revealing, exposing hidden premises that within a particular milieu, a particular culture, everybody so agrees with them that they're invisible. And those are often the most questionable ones. I mean, this is often how we've made progress, that we uncover premises that were nobody even knew that anybody was assuming them because they were so deep down in everybody's point of view. How do we ferret those out and bring them up for critical questioning, see if we can really defend them? Often it's by inviting more people into the conversation, people who may not share your presumptions. Mm-hmm. So, and that has been a real, at least within these ethereal realms that I've been fortunate enough to occupy, has been a real change over the last few years.
But I must ask you, I mean, how should we understand what reason actually is? I mean, we all agree that reason is a product of evolution somehow, and I'm thinking of, we talked earlier today about this book by Sperber and Mercier. I think it's called Enigma of Reason in English. In Swedish, Förnuft och fördom, it's called in Swedish. They are arguing a little bit against Kahneman, for example, that reason has developed through evolution not to understand what's true. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to keep the group together, to win arguments, and therefore survive, which means that reason hasn't been developed to understand what's true as the primary project, so to speak. So what is your definition of what reason actually is, given that?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish reasoning from reason.
Yeah. Okay.
Reason being the laws of logic and probability and inherent relations among ideas, more traditionally the subject matter of philosophy and neighboring disciplines like logic, and reasoning, which would be the topic in psychology of how we do or don't implement the principles of reason. I think Sperber and Mercier probably go too far, and I think in the book they even back off from the strict hypothesis that human reasoning evolved just to win our arguments. Not so much, I think, to strengthen the group, but as a weapon of competition within the group as to who is most influential. But it's unlikely to be true, and I think they back off on that simply because, as Philip K. Dick put it, reality is that which doesn't go away when you stop believing in it.
That's a good definition.
And the thing is that our ancestors, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, did have to deal not only with a real world with laws of physics and real organisms and predictable behavior, but what makes humans special is that we did internalize models of the environment, we being our evolutionary ancestors, and use them to our advantage in outsmarting animals and plants and enemies. Rebecca and I were once given a tour of an area in South Africa by Louis Liebenberg, who studied the tracking abilities of the Kung San, the Kalahari Bushmen, one of the last surviving hunter-gatherer peoples. And he noted that they basically stayed alive by outsmarting animals. And he took their hunting style as a modern remnant of the one that he thought applied to our ancestors. We cannot outrun an ungulate, a herbivore. They're much faster than we are. We can't wrestle them to the ground. They're stronger than we are. One thing that humans can do is pursue them until they keel over from the heat, because humans can shed a lot of heat. Furry animals can't.
We can bring along water bottles.
We can bring along water in gourds. But the crucial thing is that since they are much faster, the ability to pursue them until they collapse of heat stroke depends on tracking. And tracking depends on inference, which is very much like scientific inference. What was the species of animal that left that track? What was its age? What was its physical condition? Is it getting tired? And they would use that both as an individual inference, but also in reasoning, in arguments with each other, because it mattered a great deal whether it was an animal that was still full of energy and where it would be fruitless to try to pursue it over the horizon, or one whose whereabouts could be predicted and was starting to falter. And there would be arguments including young hunters challenging the elders, the more prestigious members, saying, no, your argument doesn't work. It's probably this animal or probably that condition. And he documented in these dialogues something very much akin to scientific or even philosophical reasoning. And you can also see the adaptive value, namely either you do outrun the springbok or you don't. And if you do, then you eat, and if you don't, you go hungry, and that's a powerful selection.
And it was the cogency of the argument that would determine, do they go this way or do they go that way? So to answer, what's reasoning, I mean, so philosophers, of course, have a ready-made answer, and it basically comes in three varieties. There's deductive reasoning, which is, strict logic. And basically there is avoid contradictions, proposition P and proposition not P cannot both be true. And if you look at the history of philosophy, these early Platonic dialogues, what Socrates would do in the early dialogues was he would elicit from his audience, his interlocutors, several premises and deduce a contradiction and say, go back. And I'm not going to tell you which one of your premises is wrong, but one of them is. And we get that. Humans, I've time and again caught people in contradictions, and they realize something is wrong. Something has to, I've used it on the most religious members of my family. And I don't often like the premise that they change. It's not the one I would change, but they change it, And so that is deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning, is that you learn from experience. And when you see, A is always correlated with B, you expect A to be correlated with B again, And then there's what we call abduction, which inference, which is extremely useful, and that's inference to the best explanation. We have a bunch of data, and we offer explanations, and then we try to decide. And this is the sort of thing that you were describing here. There was more or less abduction that was going on among the hunters. Which is the best explanation? And we use all sorts of criteria to judge elegance and, Occam's razor, all sorts of, but we take the data and we try to come up with an
Occam's razor to select the most simple explanation of the
but even there, lots of questions. Simple in what way? Does it introduce fewest new ontological elements? Is it fewest premises? So there's a lot of give and there's a lot of argument, but basically these are the three categories of reasoning, and they're clearly useful. They clearly have survival value.
But still, I mean, I agree. Of course, evolution has produced a concept of reason that most often gives us also the truth. I mean, it's better to believe a tiger is a tiger and not something else.
Yes.
But from psychological experiments, we know that our reasoning doesn't always give us. I think this is a wonderful experiment. You probably know of this. When you randomize hundreds of small portrait photos on a computer screen, and you can measure your eye movements to see one of them is you, and one of the pictures is of you. And you can measure your eye movements to see how fast you find yourself among these hundreds of portraits. And the thing is, if the picture of you is photoshopped, so you look better, then you find yourself faster. It's empirically verified.
Makes total sense. Yeah.
Isn't that quite interesting?
It's wonderful.
So obviously it doesn't see reality as it is, but yeah. Anyway.
If I can just add, in terms of going back to our hunter-gatherer ancestors, who I think get blamed for far too much human irrationality.
Okay.
This is another account from Louis Liebenberg. He said that one of the young members of the tribe explained to him their understanding of the sunset, sunrise. That every night, the sun is like an eland, a large antelope, and when it reaches the west, then one of the gods kills it, and then there's a big flow of blood, and that's why the sunset is red. And then when it gets dark, the bones of the eland are thrown by God over the sky, and they land up in the east, and they get reconstituted as an eland again every day. So he told the story, and ancient and passed down. And then he said to Louis, he said, you know something? I don't know. I've listened for those bones flying over the sky from west to east every night, and I don't hear them. So I don't believe this story. So scientific skepticism also probably goes way back.
That's quite interesting, yeah. But okay, well, let me go back to something that you mentioned in both of your speeches, as I remember it. Objective moral values. I mean, how do you... First of all, how do you infer moral values from reasoning only? And how can you conceive from an ontological perspective something like objective moral values?
Yeah.
Let me hear how you think about that. I know it's a big thing.
Only.
I know. But still.
Yeah. I ought to stand on one leg to answer this, right? That's an old Jewish, that comes, I think, from the Talmud, actually, that some skeptic asked a great Rabbi Hillel, there are so many books of Judaism. I want you to summarize them while standing on one leg.
Okay.
And he proceeded to stand on one leg, and he said, what you don't want done to yourself, don't do to others. The rest is all commentary. Now go and study.
Okay. And that's how Confucius framed that as well.
It's a deep intuition we have that we realize we want certain things for our own life. I mean, we want to survive and we want to persist, and we feel we have a right to. And when people do certain things to us for no good reason, but that hurt us greatly, our emotions themselves speak out our moral truth. We feel moral outrage, moral indignation. These are very complicated emotions that already have within them a moral claim. You had no right to do that to me. I'm a human being. You had no right to do that to me. And we all know this, if not on our own behalfs, on the behalf of our children. We certainly know this, the outrage we feel when something unjust is done to them. But this is, and this is the other side of Spinoza's quantitas, right? I mean, our drive to survive and to persist, and perhaps it's all coming from our genes or whatever, but we can't live our life without recognizing in ourselves and in the way that we react to other people that we feel that we have a right, and that we often will insist that others recognize our right. Well, as soon as we are doing that, insist that others, the example I always give is, say I'm lying on the beach, soaking up some rays, and some big fat guy wants to walk from point A to point B. I'm in the midpoint, and he just walks right over me, puts his big fat foot right on my stomach. I'm going to be very angry, to say the least, and think, what right does this person have to do such a thing, to cause me such needless pain? It's not getting him anything.
Yeah.
We would all feel that. This is a very morally dense reaction. And then when
But you can
ask
explain
someone,
it with group behavior from an evolutionary. You don't need objective values to explain that.
No, but the thing is, as soon as you proclaim it for yourself, that nobody has that right, and somebody else says, well, why not? You know, you're just you, I'm me. If you ask them to explain, well, why what's special about them? What would give them the right to behave this way that is different from you, you're going to be able to catch them up. They're going to say something crazy, like the universe revolves around them, but it doesn't revolve around you. They would have to presume some sort of special metaphysical, ontological status in the world, that they have a certain right that they can't give to you. And it's from this very simple reasoning, from what we know in our own case, and from those that we love, that there are certain rights, you know, we have certain rights, and we rightly feel incensed when those aren't recognized. From that, if you ask the question, well, why would I have this right and not the next guy? Well, we found many reasons to say why our group has this right and not the other group. Oh, you know, we're white male property owners and all of this. And that's what progress has been. We've wiped down those so-called justifications for distinguishing between the rights that some people claim for themselves and didn't accord to others. And that has all been a process of reason. No, you can't distinguish rights in that way, right? No, it doesn't really matter if you're a white male property owner.
But couldn't this still be a social contract of some sort?
I think it's a matter of logical coherence. If you're going to claim certain rights for yourself and your kin, and who doesn't, who would avoid, even if they claim that they don't claim these, if they say they don't claim these rights, who can avoid feeling indignation and outrage when certain things are done? If you're going to express those emotions and make claims on others because of them, you've got to universalize it. And that has been the whole force of moral philosophy. That's what Kant's categorical and imperative is all about.
But some philosophers actually believe in ontologically objective moral values,
like they're out
Derek
there.
Parfit or Peter Singer. Do you agree with that?
I don't think that they actually. I mean, I'm claiming there's objectivity in the same way that there's objectivity in mathematics, right? You know, we have certain concepts of numbers, and then other truths objectively follow from them, right? And so in that sense, there's objectivity. If we were creatures who weren't formed by evolution and therefore did not have our genes pushing us to achieve survival and a flourishing life, and therefore, living our lives with this sense that we have the right to make plans and act on them if it's not hurting anybody else. If we, given that this is the kind of creature that we are and that we can't live our lives without making these claims, then logic, the force of reason, pushes us to universalize it. It's a long, slow process, and there's a lot of oppositional force against it. In particular, drawing circumference between our group and other groups, so that.
I must ask you, before going back to earthly matters, and we're actually going to end soon, but I want to ask you one more pure philosophical question. If you all subscribe to, as you have presented, metaphysical naturalism, so to speak, and the deterministic universe in the sense of natural laws and so on, how can we choose to believe what is true? I mean, is there a free will in that kind of naturalistic universe at all? A small question. At the end of the evening.
The other foot. Stand on the other foot.
What's your views on that?
Yeah, well, I took that hard one. Why don't you take a stab at this one?
Right.
Well, free will can mean different things. I mean, it can mean a literal defiance of determinism in the mathematical sense of no options, no branching, no possible way that things could have turned out differently. And there may be reasons to believe that determinism in that sense it happens to be false, that there may be quantum effects that are not perfectly reproducible. There may be deterministic effects that in practice are so nonlinear and so depend on fluctuations in initial conditions that for all intents and purposes they're not deterministic. Chaotic effects and butterfly wings starting hurricanes and all of that.
Chaos theory.
Yeah, not literally. And it could be that what we think of as free will is events in the brain that are not completely predictable from initial conditions, whether from quantum effects or just from thermal noise and nonlinear dynamics. I think that's not exactly what people want when they want to preserve free will, because it just says that there's something about us that will always be unpredictable. We kind of want free will, paradoxically, to be responsive to certain conditions, such as anticipation of praise and blame and reward and punishment from our community. One of the reasons that we hold people responsible for their acts, say in criminal justice, is that we kind of hope that by doing it, other people who see the example and that person in the future will not engage in harmful acts because they want to avoid the punishment. So there's a bit of an irony in that by enshrining free will as the heart of our moral and legal system, we're kind of counting on a little bit of determinism, namely the very fact that we believe in free will affect how people will exercise that free will. And maybe you can even throw the free will out and just say, well, if the brain is a complex information processing system, it's been shaped by natural selection and then tuned by learning to respond in some ways to some kinds of information. Given a persuasive argument, it is wired to accept the logical conclusion. Given certain contingencies of moral valuation, it's good to give to charity, it's bad to attack people. The brain will then respond to those contingencies by adjusting its behavior, adjusting its belief. That entire process, we tend to describe it to ourselves in the language of free will. We say, yes, you hear the evidence and you choose to be persuaded. You see how people will react to an action and you control your own behavior accordingly. At the level of analysis of humans talking to one another, it's unavoidable to use the language of free will. But when we step back as scientists or as philosophers committed to naturalism, we might say, well, what we call free will is in fact a very, very, very complex and not completely predictable property of brain circuitry.
Okay.
But we still want to distinguish between the brain circuitry that leads to good reasoning and the brain circuitry that is also there, you know, all the cognitive fallacies that just as determined by the brain circuitry. You know, it's just extremely important within all of this to just hold the distinction between good reasoning and good actions and bad. And what we really want from all of this is accountability. I think that's what you were getting at. You know, I don't care if you call it free will, determinism, or what. It's very, very important that we hold ourselves, you know, and others accountable for their actions and their beliefs. I believe this very strongly. It's a great human responsibility to take beliefs very seriously and to examine them as critically as possible, even the ones that we hold most dear.
Last question to you now. In just a few minutes, you will be out there signing your books. Perfect chance to get Christmas present to celebrate Isaac Newton. But last question before that. I mean, the world as it looks like right now, with anti-scientific trends and populism and nationalism and everything, what should we do to raise awareness of the Enlightenment values and reason? I mean, in our practical daily life, what can we do?
Yeah.
What's your idea?
Yeah. Well,
The current situation.
yeah, dialogue is extremely important, and not just within our own. I mean, I'm just such a, for me, it's very hard because I'm personally very shy, so I don't strike up conversations with strangers, but I can write books. That's a shy person's form of dialogue. Yeah, with a great deal of sympathy for, always know what's going on. And behind irrationality, here's a very optimistic statement I'm going to put forth. And I think I might even believe it.
Sounds good.
I do believe that there's something deeply rational about humans. I think we don't like logical contradictions. I've seen it time and time and again. I've seen it in myself, where I've had to give up dearly beloved beliefs. I've seen it in other people. We don't like to be faced, and being faced with counter evidence is a form of also of a logical contradiction. We do something. We accommodate ourselves to it in some way or other. That's one of our saving graces, and I think that we have to appeal to that, so that when I see great waves of irrationality is there's something overcoming our natural rationality. What is it? What is the pain? What's the suffering? What is the loss of status, of dignity, of something that's going on that's causing this irrationality? Instead of just preaching, be like us, I don't know. That's my reaction to it. To try to, I suppose that's why sometimes I feel driven to write novels as opposed to just writing straight philosophy, because behind movements, behind irrationality, are people who I'm trying to do the best they can with what they've been dealt, and it's often very important to just understand on an individual level the story, the narrative, what's going on. It's the best way, I think, to...
Steve, what's your take on that question?
Well, since Rebecca gave a kind of philosopher's perspective, I'll give a complementary scientific perspective that rooted more in empirical observation. That I think that in our discourse, in our educational system, in intellectual life, in journalism, we should be mindful of a slightly bigger empirical picture of what are successful societies, what are horrific societies. We should remember that as whatever the threats to democracy may be now, if you look at a list of democracies in the 1980s, it was a fraction of the size. Half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain. Most of Latin America was under the control of military dictatorships. Spain and Portugal were fascist. Greece was under the control of a military junta. We should remember that life expectancy a couple of hundred years ago was less than half of what it was today. Infant mortality much higher. And also remind ourselves that these are accomplishments that can break down by looking at parts of the world that have moved away from liberal democracy, moved away from application of science. We could look at Venezuela, and we could look at Yemen, and we could look at Afghanistan, and we could look at South Sudan, and look at Haiti. This is how bad life can be if you don't have state-of-the-art medical system, if you don't have a liberal democracy. I think we tend to be, in our discourse, in our conversations, in our debates, so focused on what has gone wrong today or yesterday and on what needs to be fixed, which is important. But we tend to take for granted the great accomplishments of a liberal democracy compared to its alternatives, of theocracy, of military dictatorship, of totalitarian communist dictatorship. We need a little bit of recent history. We need a little bit of data comparing life in the best societies with those that could do a lot worse, just to keep our view of the world in perspective.
That's an optimistic ending of this evening. Rebecca and Steve, thank you so much for coming. Thank you all for coming.